All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the State Hornets panel with Sacramento Police Chief Daniel Hahn and Jamilia Land talking about gun violence. The State Hornet previously did a feature on their experiences with gun violence and their friendship despite their differences in beliefs. So we have Chief Daniel Hahn, who is a Sac State alumnus that not only served as the first Black police chief in Roseville, but was the first Black police officer ever in that department. He is also the first Black police chief in Sacramento at the Sacramento Police Department, which is a position that he currently holds. And Jamilia Land, an Oakland native, is what some would call a local activist in Sacramento and a self-proclaimed humanitarian who helps families that have been affected by police and community-involved shootings with her program, the Anti-Violence, Safety, and Accountability Project. So the State Hornet is hosting these leaders to discuss the causes of gun violence in Sacramento and the steps that the community can take to reduce the occurrence of gun violence. If anyone in the audience would like to submit questions, please use the Q&A portion at the bottom of the Zoom, which will be hosted by our news editors, Mercy Sosa and Cameron Dady. Please do so using the, like I said, the Q&A function. When you submit your questions, please be respectful, and this will be recorded and posted to the State Hornet YouTube channel. So starting off, I would like to know, Jamilia, how did you start along this humanitarian route? How did that start for you?
Well, I think I was more so born into it. I come from a long line of people who have been active in the community, but just love people. You know, my mother and my father were both members of the Black Panther Party for self-defense out of Oakland. So at a very young age, I want to say between 5 and 7 years old is when my parents started really engaging me in community involvement. So from feeding people in our communities to going to the park and distributing blankets to the homeless. It's just kind of always been who I am.
And Chief Hahn, how did you get along the route of becoming a police officer?
Oh, that's a long, windy, twisty route. You don't want to know all that. I never planned on being a police officer. So it was really kind of by accident. And then I planned on leaving. And eventually I found jobs working closely with the community within the police department and kind of fell in love with the work that I never knew that you could do as a police officer. So it was really by accident. And now it's almost 34 years later. So glad I accidentally found this line of work.
And then I'm curious, with today's social climate, it is unique to see a police officer and an activist being friends. So I would like to know how you met and how you became friends.
So I'm going to say that I don't really look at him as the chief of police, just like I don't look at myself as an activist. I look at him as Daniel Hahn, the man, the father, the husband, the human, who just so happens to also be the chief of police. One thing that I grew up with is that you judge a person based on the character that they exhibit. And Daniel is a man of integrity. He genuinely cares about his community, about his people. And so my friendship is Jamilia with Daniel, not the activist and the chief of police. And I think a lot of times they're often thrown off because, I'll be the first one to say, oh, Daniel, that's my dog. And they go, wait a minute, we're totally confused because you're walking with families that have been impacted by police violence, yet, one of your good friends is the chief of police. How does that work? Because I don't group people in to certain things. And he knows we've had several conversations where, I am still very much so against anti-bad policing. It's not that I'm anti-police, I'm anti-bad policing in our communities. And I do believe that law enforcement should be held to a different level of accountability. But I'm not going to villainize or demonize my friend because he happens to wear that uniform. Daniel's never so much as pulled his gun out and shot an unarmed or armed person in the 30 plus years of his career. And so when people clap at me and say, well, how is it that you're dealing with police? I'm not necessarily dealing with the police. There are some officers that I absolutely love as human beings. Officer Graham, that's my dog, love Phil, Debrielle, there's several others. But again, it's because I see them as people, not as law enforcement. And in the capacity of law enforcement, they have engaged me very differently because they know the nature of the work that I do. So he's not the chief of police to me. That's Daniel. But there are times that we have to function in the capacity of him being the chief of police. So,
yeah, I'll add a little detail to that. We first met at actually at Sac State at a Martin Luther King dinner, and I had heard her name and seen her in the media, but I had never met her individually. And so somebody brought her over to me to introduce us at the dinner. And I'll be honest, I was probably looking at her, not when she was in my face, but cross-eyed, like, okay, where is this gonna go? But so I was looking at her as an activist, and I was looking at myself as a police officer when we first met. But I think the reason why we've become friends and this has lasted is because quickly I saw her as just a human being that wanted some change and wanted life to be better for people, which is what the core for me is too. So there are times where we disagree on things, but I think that more often than not, we agree at the core. We sometimes might disagree on how to go about it, but at the core, we both want the same thing, which is life better for people and people to be unharmed and things like that. And so I think as long as you have that at the core, you can have relationships like this. And she has helped on a lot of things in our community that made life better for others. And she's taken some heat for it, and she does it anyway. And I will always respect somebody like that, whether I always agree with them or not.
And we're going to kind of jump right into why we're here talking about gun violence. With the discussions I've had with both of you, I know that you both have had personal experiences, and I'm wondering if you would share that with the audience. What are your personal experiences with gun violence?
Woo. You want to take this one first?
I'll go first this time. Well, I grew up in Oak Park, and guns were not as prevalent then as they are now, but it was not uncommon to hear gunshots ring out in my neighborhood. I lived at the corner of 33rd and 2nd Avenue, which was pretty much a hot spot for things like sex trafficking and drugs. I witnessed my first murder when I was about 9 years old, when I had come home from church and somebody was getting shot multiple times. And so my older brother and I were the only witnesses to that. So I actually had to testify in a jury trial in Superior Court when I was about however old you are in junior high, 11 or 12 years old, at Superior Court here in Sacramento, that I've testified many times since then as a police officer. But at 11 and 12 years old, it's a much different experience than a jury trial for murder because my brother and I were the only witnesses. And then my younger brother was murdered in downtown Sacramento in 1992 after he got involved with drugs. And obviously, as a police officer, I've seen more gun violence than any human being should. So, yeah.
Ooh, okay. So I was born and raised in Oakland. The first time I saw someone shot, I was 13 years old. I was coming out of a corner convenience store, and a neighborhood friend was, at that time, we had different terminologies, and 12 gauge shotguns were really big at that time. And they used to call it a practice of being gauged. And I had started to walk towards the exit door, and I had forgot my change, and the cashier called me back. And as I retrieved my change and I turned around, I saw my friend almost breaching the doorway when another young man came up and just unloaded on him with a 12-gauge shotgun in the chest. Since then, I have lost several nieces and nephews, a total of 6. I've lost my daughter-in-law. It's almost as though gun violence has been the norm in my life, and I don't think that I'm exclusive to that. As a matter of fact, I know I'm not. It's a part of our community, which is very unfortunate because gun violence in our communities have become normalized. In our communities, we either know someone who has been killed, or we know someone who is doing the killings, and a lot of times they are relatively close to us. So gun violence has always been a part of my life. But I go one step further and say I think that we, as quote unquote citizens of the United States of America, every last one of us has a history with gun violence, because that's a part of what this country is rooted in.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. With your jobs, with both of your jobs, you've had to talk to a lot of families who have dealt with gun violence. What is one experience that has stuck out with you to this day?
That's a tough one. So I think that's a tough one. The first really hard one for me was my daughter-in-law. Sitting in the courtroom, knowing that a 17-year-old boy pulled up on the car and opened fire and shot and killed her, and sitting there and watching the coroner do his presentation and watching her body lay lifeless on a table in pictures, having been cut wide open for an autopsy. Emotionally, that one's still really hard for me because I just talking about it, I can still see it. Excuse me. Dang it. Sorry. Sometimes it's hard. I think one of the most challenging has been the most recent, has been the killing of the 2 young boys at Arden Fair Mall. They were my daughter's friends. And watching the community's response, but more importantly, watching their father. A lot of times in our communities, there is this misconception that Black men, number one, are not in the home, and number two, that they're not participatory in their sons' lives. Whereas here, it was completely different. And Dwayne was very active in his children's life, to know that he brought them from Louisiana to California to escape potential gun violence. And they ended up succumbing to it here, traveling back to Louisiana with them. And I think what got me the most was at the gravesite, watching him get in the ground and lay on top of his sons and just want to be in there with him, but knowing that he had to continue with life while he holds his 1-year-old son, who will never know his brothers. And so I think that all of them are unique situations. They all hurt. But that one really, really touched home, because most of the times it's mothers that we're consulting, or consoling, excuse me. But to see this father raw in his emotion, and then be so amazingly strong to say to the young man who took his son's life that he forgives them. He forgives him, that he has no hatred for him, and that he has compassion for his parents, just really says a lot. So, like I said, they're all unique. They all hurt.
Yeah, I think mine are pretty similar to Jamila's. The first one is my brother, who was murdered because, well, one, it's my brother, but two, I was a police officer at by that time in 1992, and it occurred in my beat and on my shift. And so I actually responded to the call and identified him. But what I remember most, besides just seeing him, is I was in a real hurry to leave the scene so I could go call my mom. And so I use this story a lot for today when we work in communities, because my younger brother was not being healthy to himself. He was a drug addict, and he wasn't healthy for the community either. I don't know all the things he was doing, but I imagine there was a lot of bad things he was doing in the community to support himself and all that. But my mom bawled, just like if her son was the president of the United States, because these kids that are getting gunned down, regardless of what they're doing that might be bad, whether it's violence or drugs or any other type of crime or destructive behavior, is still somebody's son. And so, so my mom didn't cry or feel any less. She knew her youngest son was involved in those things, but it didn't make him any less of her son and love him any less. The second one, I would say the same one as Jamilia, and partly because it's pretty recent, but also because of many things in response to that. So if we look at those two young 17 and 19-year-old boys that were killed in the mall, our response as a society and as a community was much different to that, and in my opinion, because of their race, than it was to other shootings, say like Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha. What the words we use and the things we said about the shooting here versus the things we say about the shooting there are greatly different. And then the last thing I would 100% agree, the other thing that really makes that memorable is their father. And I cannot forget that I was very surprised that he said he forgave people. And this was not like 6 years after his sons were killed. This was like a week after his two boys, like both his sons gone in the blink of an eye. And he says to the whole world, he forgives the young man that shot them. I mean, I've never seen such a thing. So that stands out to me also.
Again, I want to thank you guys for being open and just being vulnerable in that moment and sharing those memories with us. Kind of going into following up with that, seeing so much gun violence, how do you not let those emotions overtake you? How do you prioritize your mental health when dealing with these difficult situations? Because you both deal with it on kind of a constant basis.
Well, I'll go first. I think Jamilia did show some emotion, so she, yeah. I think a couple of things. I saw my fair share of violence growing up, so I do think there's some desensitization when you see it so frequently. It somewhat becomes normalized. But I think that's really on the outside, because on the inside, you still are feeling it. So eventually, I believe it will catch up to you. But I think there are certain people are better at dealing with stress than others. And then at work, obviously, I've seen a lot of violence. And so I think I handle it pretty well, but I also know it's still impacting. No matter how good you are, it's impacting you. So really the way I deal with all kind of stress, whether it's from violence or just the job, is I work out. So I make it a point that I work out every day. So that's my release and my ability to handle the stress, and then watch my daughters play sports. So I could sit there all day and watch them, and that's I don't think about nothing else, just watch them play. So that's the way I zone out. So.
That's a great question. I do a combination of things. I cry in silence, but the number one thing that I do is my closet is my prayer room, and I make it a point daily to quiet myself and go and sit in my closet and spend time with God, sometimes with some dirty laundry in God, but we're in there nonetheless. And I'm constantly asking him to just help me. I think a lot of people don't necessarily see me as I don't know, that maybe these things don't bother me, because sometimes I can come across just very matter of fact, very professional, but people don't realize I'm a crier. I'm a crybaby. These things hurt, but because I've been through so much by myself, and I didn't have anyone to hold my hand and walk me through and be there for me, that how I deal with this is being there for other people. I can't bring your loved one back, but what I can do is I can stand in the gap and I can be there for you. I can hold your hand. I can help expedite the process or processes that you may find yourself going through. I can educate you based on my experience and the experience of others, what to expect. But at the end of the day, I go to God, I cry, and every now and again, I call Daniel and I cuss.
You made me lose my composure. Thanks. I want to say a reminder to the audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom. So going back, we've had this conversation before, even though there's not a one size fits all solution, what do you think could be done to help reduce gun violence?
Well, you know, at the end of the day, my solution is you won't have gun violence if you don't have guns. However, America loves her guns, and I don't believe that we're ever going to get rid of them. And so I believe that education is empowering, and that one of the problems that I see personally in the African American community is, number one, guns and violence are glorified, but we're not necessarily the ones who created the atmosphere of glorifying guns and violence. But our children are not just our children, but adults as well, but specifically our children are not being trained properly on the use of handguns. The adults are not properly storing handguns. And to add to that, our culture is one that indoctrinates our youth with violence. For example, we have all of these violent video games where our youth are desensitized to picking up a gun and pointing it at someone and shooting without really understanding the ramifications of number one, what a bullet does to flesh, and number two, the impact of taking someone's life. And so I believe that education is a very empowering tool.
Yeah, I'm with Jamilia on, you know, a lot of people want to compare our country to other countries. And in some of those circumstances, it's not really a fair comparison, because guns are not as prevalent and as valued in other countries as they are in ours. And I'm pretty sure we are not going to get rid of guns. I mean, California is one of the more restrictive states in regards to guns. Chicago has some very restrictive laws, and they're like the shooting capital of the country right now. And so I do think there are some logical gun laws that we can implement, not only just here in Sacramento or California, but across our country. I mean, there's some guns that there's really, why would you have a gun that can do all that? It's like a gun for war and things like that. So I think there are some very logical things that we could all maybe get behind, and that would make us safer in terms of the ability for somebody to kill so many people in one event. But at the same time, you know, I grew up in a neighborhood where if I wanted a gun, I could have got a gun. And a lot of people did, and went to prison and got killed. Many people I know have been in prison, and they're all in their 50s now, like me. So that many of them are out and doing really good things now, but they spent a good portions of their life in prison, some because of guns and things like that. So why did me and some of my friends not do that and others did? So I think a lot of times in our communities, and a lot of it is rooted in our history, the history of this country, but many people in the neighborhoods that we often talk about do not have hope that their life can be something different, and that they can have certain jobs. They literally don't think they could do that. So if you have no hope and you have no thing you're striving for, then why not get in that car and go do a shooting when somebody disrespects you? Why not get in that car, drive down that street and take a shot at a rival or something like that? The reason I didn't is I was in fear of what I would lose. I was fearing my mom would beat me to death. But more than that, long-term wise, I was in fear that that would ruin my dreams. Like I wouldn't be able to attain things because I had dreams and I had hopes. And so a lot of that is like, I'm not going to get in the car with you because if I get arrested, then I won't be able to go to college. I won't be able to have a family. I won't. So I think we need to collectively figure out how do we ensure that all of our kids have equity and hope for a brighter future, and then they will not pick up that gun for some things that we look at as, why would anybody do that? But if you're living in their world, there's every reason why you do that.
Well, to kind of piggyback on what he's saying, a lot of times people don't realize that our youth they're crying out. It's a completely different experience growing up now than when we did. And I know he said he's almost 50 years old, so I'm gonna go ahead and tell you, you know, we might be close, but we ain't that close, yeah. But you know, like we grew up, right, where you be in the house before the street light comes on, where there was a sense of community, where if you got to cutting up and you was acting up, boy, on your way home, Miss Jackson, Mr. Johnson, Miss Ruby, they all had something to say. They were gonna call home. There was a level of accountability for one another in the community. We don't have that anymore. And our youth are experiencing so many different adversities coming up that by the time they're, you know, 12, 13, 14 years old, they're choosing criminal behavior as coping mechanisms, right? To deal with those adverse experiences that they've had as children. And most importantly, they are not being taught how to problem solve. They are not being taught how to critically think and analyze. And they're not being equipped with the skill set to resolve conflict in a healthy way. And so, you know, I think that all of that contributes to it as well. Because like Daniel said, you know, like growing up, we had something to lose. My mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, my father, somebody was going to tear me out the frame if I thought twice about it. You know, I had to stop and think, you know, but these kids today, they don't have that. A lot of them are coming up, you know, they've been exposed to the foster care system. They're being raised by a third party non-parent. You know, they're in communities that are economically deprived. There's food insecurities. There's lack of educational opportunities. There's no community programs. There's no after school. There's no art. There's no, you know, physical education. And so these children, and then you throw into the mix that we're dealing with a different generation, right? Because a lot of the younger children, you know, 10 and under that we're seeing now, they are the products of the crack cocaine epidemic babies. And so we're, you know, when we're hearing it in the music, the lean, the Molly, the Percocet, though that's the generation that was born addicted to crack cocaine. And so there's also the chemical component of what's happening inside of the bodies, in addition to what's happening in their environment.
And then Jamilia, I had a follow-up question because you're talking about education. And I want to know, what does that education about guns look like, and how would it be implemented? As well as you work with the community, how do you try to educate your fellow community members?
So I believe that the education, very specifically around the youth, begins with an assessment. That assessment begins by actually sitting down and talking to the youth. And the earlier we can get to them, I think the better it is that we can plan on how do we build out a curriculum that is specific for them, and taking into account that there is no one size fits all. You know, as young as 4 or 5 years old, they are sitting in front of the TV, they are sitting on the video game. So engaging them and asking them questions to find out what it is that they already know. How much of that is actually factual? How much of it is fictional? And then begin to build out from there.
And then after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, many went out and protested in Sacramento and all over the country, all over the world. Many have called to defund the police. What do you both think is a step to help reduce police-involved shootings?
Well, again, it's like any significant issue in our country. There's no one simple solution. And I think too often we fall, whether it's our politicians, our community leaders, or law enforcement, we fall into that trap trying to find that one simple solution. And there is no one simple solution. It's a very nuanced problem that requires a nuanced solution. So I think part of it is, how do officers respond and what tools do they have that they could use instead of a lethal weapon like a gun? So that would be things like beanbag shotguns, 40mm sponge rounds, pepper balls, tasers. And so how readily accessible are those tools to all officers as they respond? So when you go department to department, that could vary. And so just within the last year or so, we've equipped all of our officers with those things, and they actually use them on a nightly basis. So in certain circumstances, had they not had them, we would have another shooting, but because they have them. So if you don't have those things, then you're probably gonna have more shootings when that would even be justified, but they don't have to end up in a shooting if you had other tools. So I always relate that even if a shooting is legal, could it have been prevented? And if so, what would that be? Because we don't want anybody to be shot. So that's one. The other thing is, I think it's happening across the country. It just has to happen in a very well thought out manner. And that's a different response besides police officers to many things. And I think that is a very good road to go down, as long as we do it in a well thought out manner that does not get people hurt. We don't want to send a social worker to an incident that we could probably anticipate there's going to be somebody there with weapons and then get that social worker hurt. So, but I do think that's very promising. And I'll just give an example. There's a lot, and typically these wouldn't be violent situations, but when a police officer graduates from the academy, they can put a 72-hour hold on somebody under certain conditions with in a mental health crisis. Very few other people can do that. So I've actually responded, and our officers respond now to mental health clinics because the clinician cannot do that, even though they've gone to probably 1 million years of school, whereas an officer has a couple of 8-hour classes, but they still call the police officer because only the police officer can put a hold. So I think some of those things need to change. We are asking police departments to do things that increasingly do things that we haven't always been. And then I think I think there is a part where bias and history play a role, and we need to address all those things. Laws by themselves will not change this. We have to change hearts and minds, not just of police officers, but our entire country. And I think if we do those and others, we will see a significant change.
Okay, so, that's one of my questions. So one, I'm gonna start with the defund the police. And I'm very cautious. And for some of the viewers, this is not to offend anyone, but I'm gonna say it because this is my personal opinion. I don't do the hashtag activism. What I mean by that is, we saw after the unfortunate killing of George Floyd, the emergence of this terminology, defund the police. And I think that a lot of people, if you ask people what does that mean to them, right? Most people will tell you, well, for us, that means, decreasing law enforcement's budgets and reallocating that funding into community programs and things of that nature, right? But I challenge people to really think about it. Number one, is defunding the police going to make them stop shooting and killing people? No. Number two, we need to actually look at the data as to what are the communities that actually call for service the most from law enforcement. When you look at that data, you will come to discover that the same communities that are being plagued by this type of violence are the same communities that are predominantly calling for service from law enforcement, okay? But then there's also around this conversation of defunding the police that I don't think a lot of people think about. What about the victims of crime? Such as the 2 young boys that were killed at Arden Fair Mall. Where do their families go? Where do crime victims' families go when they are in need of help? When they are in need of someone capturing the person who has taken the life of their loved one? I think that it is a noble thought that we could say, you know, well, defund the police, reallocate that money to our communities, and we'll take care of ourselves. But my question to the communities are, do we actually have to begin to have that funding for us to start making a shift in our communities to do that? Because can I call on you as a neighbor, as a fellow community member, if someone breaks into my house, if someone rapes one of my children, if someone, you know, damages my property or takes the life of my loved one? How far of a capacity do we in the community have for that? And so I think that we have to be careful when we are talking about these things and our responses are coming from an emotionally charged place, that we have to actually think them out in totality. And so along the thought process, though, of defunding, well, if it's about economically re-enfranchising the communities that are experiencing these things in the first place, well, then we need to defund across the board, not just law enforcement. We need to defund educational systems. We need to defund healthcare systems. We need to defund, you know, all of these other systems and create a fund or a pot to re-enfranchise those communities, okay? And then what was the second part of your question?
Sorry, we're moving the questions around. Just with people calling to defund the police, what do you think is a step to help reduce police involved shootings?
Well, I'm just gonna say it again. Number one, having no guns, but we're not going to actually get there, right? But I'm gonna say what I think, you know, a lot of people are uncomfortable hearing. And it is this: we can call it implicit bias, we can call it, you know, differences of opinion, but the reality of it is systemic racism. Over 50% of law enforcement officers in this country are white males. This country has systematically, psychologically indoctrinated its residents to believe that people who look like Daniel and myself are threats just because of our skin color. And that is something that you can't legislate away. You can't fund or defund away. But it is something that I agree with him, that you have to be able to change the hearts and the minds of the people. And how do we do that when there are so many things infrastructurally that continue to fuel those things? For example, going back to the boys, the differences in how things are reported, the difference in how we look at a Black life versus a non-Black life, you know, and I'm curious as to at what age. My grandson just turned 1 year old today, beautiful child. At what age does he become a threat? At what age does America see him as a potential thug, as violent, and he's only 1 year old? So I think that, you know, at the heart of it is racism. You know, there's a lot of things that Chief Hahn does to try to help break that up. For example, before the pandemic hit, you know, we were doing the Friday Oak Park community walks, where, you know, he's got officers in training from the academy out in the community. You know, we're walking around in the community, and we got people sitting on the porch, smoking weed, playing Tupac, pit bulls barking, running up down the street. You got all these young, you know, white officers like, the hell going on around here? What you doing? And you got me reading post-traumatic slave syndrome? Like, no. But I think that that's a necessity, right? Because one of the issues that we find is that officers in our communities often don't come from our communities. They don't look like us. They don't interact with us. And that which they believe they know about us usually comes via the television, which is oftentimes very, very skewed. And so when you have people othering one another, and there is no sense of community, there is no sense of, I remember growing up, I remember being in West Oakland as a little girl, and I remember the Black police officers. And there was a time when there were more Black law enforcement officers too. But the Black police officers that were in West Oakland in our community, they came from our community. And so I think that that's important too. But trying to be a law enforcement officer, especially in this particular climate, being African American, is more of a challenge than I think people realize. And that's a part of why I really admire Daniel as my friend, because I tell people in a heartbeat, at the end of the day, you do recognize that he's Black, right? He's male, he's in America. And when he doesn't have that uniform on, and even with that uniform on, he too can still be the victim of police violence or community violence.
And Chief Hahn, I'm curious your thoughts on that. With, like I saw it covering all the protests over the summer. Defund the police was the rallying cry of the people at the protests. So what do you think, what is your thoughts on defund the police movement, as well as what could be a viable solution?
Yeah, I think there's generally, in my experience, there's been two types of defund the police. So some people think take some money away, whether it's 10 million, 50 million from the police department, and provide it to some other assistance to the community. And then some are tear the police department down completely and rebuild it in a new form. And because of the roots of law enforcement being in a racist history. So although on one hand, I understand people's frustration, because I know it looks, and oftentimes is, like nothing changed, nothing is changing. And people just like, well, just keep your head down and this too shall pass when people calm down. And therefore nothing really changes. No training changes, no policy changes, no behavior changes. So I understand the frustration that just continues to build, because we often say that these latest protests over the last year are unprecedented in our country. But if you know our history that we're not often taught in our school or ever taught, this is not unprecedented. This has happened over and over for over 200 years. Protests like this, cities burning, people being killed in protests because of these same exact issues. If you do history back to protests like in Atlanta in the early 1900s, and in other riots and protests in the 1800s, they're talking about the exact same thing: discrimination, jobs, education, the exact same thing that people are talking about in protests. So I understand the frustration that leads to these things. But the reality is, if we defund the police, our communities that we're talking about are the ones that will feel it the most. Because if anything happens in the neighborhood I grew up in, Oak Park, or like a Meadowview or Del Paso Heights, typically there's not a lot of resources, so they call the police for just about everything. But if you are in another neighborhood with more wealth and things, maybe you call your doctor for your son having a mental health challenge. And so, because you have a doctor and you have a relationship with your doctor, and you have the means and the funds and all those sort of things, so you never actually call the police. So our highest call volume are from these communities. And so if we were to cut the police department, the response would be less in those communities. In our wealthy communities, they probably won't notice any difference at all, because they're not seeing police officers now. So you take a police officer that didn't exist from a community, they don't notice. But there's often no other person to call other than the police department in a lot of our communities. So I think it's on all of us, including law enforcement, to go, okay, we do need to make some changes. Even if we think we're right, if the community doesn't trust us, if the legitimacy of our organizations is not there, then we need to do something differently. And so I understand the frustration, but I also know the people that will suffer, which is typically what happens in any situation, even outside of law enforcement. When we do these drastic things, the people that suffer are the folks in our communities like Meadowview and Del Paso, because they're the ones that are depending on these resources. So, and I have never heard somebody that I know from our community that has said, I want less police. I've never heard that one time. I've heard, I want different police. I want better police. I want, I might have some stories of an officer that didn't act the way I liked them, but they typically go, no, we need police. I just need them to act better at times. So that's what I would say.
And Chief Hahn, you're talking about things need to change. So following the protests over the summer regarding the police involved shootings, I know you kind of went into it, but what all has the Sacramento Police Department done to ensure deadly force is not the first or only option for these situations?
Yeah, we could have a whole town hall on the things that we have done and are doing. But I think before I even get into some of those, maybe the highlights, I guess, if you could call them, is I think it's also important to understand that officers do this every night. Every single night, there is an officer in a situation that they could use deadly force and they don't. Every single night, multiple times, but we don't hear about those incidents. So it can be done. But so we spend a lot of time on this issue of bias, implicit bias, of history. And so, matter of fact, tomorrow I'll be teaching a history class to our veteran officers. But we have groups like American Leadership Forum coming in and teaching about implicit bias and how to try to keep that in check, and the history of our country that we're not taught about. And I'll just give one example. McGraw-Hill, which is a publishing company of history books, both high school and college, just a few years ago in a high school history book, they described slavery as workers who immigrated to this country. That's how we teach our high school students about our history. It's as if we're like, we're going to keep that hidden so we don't have to, feel bad, I guess. And so when we do that, we are then perplexed when we go, well, why are you even talking about that? It's just immigrant workers. So we spend a lot of time both educationally, like in a classroom, talking about history, teaching about bias, but we also know that just taking a class for a couple hours is not the change that we're looking for. So one, we want to educate officers how the brain works and what our history is and what that impact is on today. But then we also do programs and provide experiences. Jamilia mentioned one of them before, that our officers can get out into the community that maybe they're not familiar with outside of the uniform and outside of a work capacity, to learn and meet and understand what different communities their hopes, dreams, and desires. And then lastly, I'll just say, I don't have all the answers either. I mean, I have my thoughts on what will work and all that, but I'm a cop. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not. So we bring Stanford's reviewing our department right now on relational and bias. Washington State is doing some teaching and reviewing our department, and then going to review the training and the effectiveness of the training and how long it lasts. The Center for Policing Equity is just concluding a study on our department. So we've really opened up our department for experts to come in and provide their recommendations. That doesn't mean I'll agree with all of them, but we want to change what's going on, because what is going on right now is obviously not healthy for people. If people are being injured both by our officers, but also in the community, but also it's not healthy for officers to live in this and work in this environment. It is not. Officers in protest being cussed out, surrounded on calls and things, that's not help. That's not a recipe for a successful, healthy 30-year career. And so for all people's purposes, we have to change this. And I, for one, in my career, want to move the needle because we have been dealing with this same exact issue for hundreds of years.
And then Jamilia, I want to know from your perspective, what do you think some solutions could be to ensure deadly force is not the first and only option in these situations?
Woo! Take the guns, take the guns. I mean, ultimately, it gets back to that, right? So I want to share an experience a tad bit before I answer that, because you know, I catch a lot of heat in the community about my friendship with Daniel and walking in these spaces. But one of the things that he's done for me that helped me to really be able to get a broader understanding was he invited me out to the academy. I've been out a couple of times. And I went through the use of force simulator. Changed my whole perspective. When I found myself standing there in this virtual simulation and I'm encountering a man in a parking garage who's between two vehicles, and he's wielding a knife, and I have a very short reaction time. And now this is my first time doing this. I'm not a trained officer, have not been through the academy. And I'm thinking about this board on the wall with, okay, these are the laws, these are the rules, all of this stuff you must keep in your mind at this time. I've got a gun, I've got a taser, and within a few moments, I'm engaging him, and I began having conversation with him. And very quickly, he advances me. And in a situation where I would have tried to just talk to someone, you know, was it the taser I pulled out, or the gun? I think I had it on the wrong side. I was shooting at the wrong stuff. And long story short, Jamilia was dead at the end of the use of force simulator. And so it gave me a different perspective on it. And I think that a big part of how we can reduce these incidents is, number one, having officers in the community that are more reflective of the people who are actually living in the community. When you know the people in the community, you're less likely to engage them in a certain manner. But also really and taking the time to step back. I mean, obviously there's some situations that you will find that use of force is a necessity. But I think where the issue is that we have, especially in the African-American communities throughout this country around relationships with law enforcement, is that too often we are seeing excessive and or deadly use of force being chosen as the first option. But specifically first option when the people look like me and Daniel, because there have been several times that we have seen where we know that we have an active white shooter who's just gone into a school or a church and shot and killed several people. We can look at 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, okay, that for whatever reasons, and we could all debate those reasons, that because they are non-melanated beings, that they are given a certain level of grace and understanding. And so I think that at the end of the day, to reduce some of these excessive and deadly use of force cases, it really comes down to dealing with the issue of racism.
Okay. I know we talked earlier about police being called for with people experiencing mental health crises. And I read reports, I believe it was with the Washington Post, that I think it was in 2019 that 25% of the police involved shootings were people dealing with a mental health crisis. For those individuals in their communities, where can they go in Sacramento to get help, as opposed to, like you said, calling the police as a first resort?
Yeah, maybe just to frame this whole panel today, I can give some stats both on mental health and gun violence in our city that might help to understand the full issue that we're dealing with. And let me first start by saying, there's always these lists. I just saw one that came out the other day nationwide on the most violent cities in the country, and Sacramento's never on those lists. But with that being said, we have way too much violence and way too much crime in our city. So yeah, there's cities and other jurisdictions that are a lot higher than us, but we are way too high. And so just to give some perspective on violence, so and the fact that it's going up. So during the pandemic, over the last year, a little over a year, even a little bit before the pandemic, many crimes have gone down, and you might suspect that, right? We don't have as many people outside anymore because we're locked in our homes now and things. So things like burglary and those sort of things have gone down some, but the thing that has gone up is violence. And so last year, 2020, homicides went up 29%. And just, they're not all gun violence, but most of them are. And so I just wanted to give some perspective on what last year held too. So shooting reports, we had 599 shooting reports last year. That was a 29% increase over the year before. Numbers of victims shot in our city last year, 217. The year before, we only had 150. It went up 44%. Number of firearms seized, 1,238, which is a 27% increase over last year. And so far this year, it's even worse than last year, even with last year's increases. So through January, we had 9 murders in our city. We only had 5 January of last year. Number of victims shot so far this year through January is up 416%. It's went from 6 to 31. The number of guns seized went up 85% in the first month of this year. So we're going in the wrong direction. So that's what we're dealing with in our community. So mental health, just to give you some perspective of what we deal with in as a city in regards to mental health. And this by far is not everything. I guarantee you our officer involved shootings, and I guess it would depend on how you describe it. You mentioned, I think 20 or 25% of police shootings involve mental health. It's higher than that. I promise you it's higher than that. So it might be how you're describing. Does he have to be a diagnosed full-blown mental health, or just have some mental health issues contributing to what the issue was? I guarantee you it's way higher. It's probably in the 80%. But calls for service for us in just January of this year, which is a typical number, we responded to 1,152 mental health related calls in 1 month. And that's typical. It's about 34 calls a day, every single day of the year, that officers are responding to. Now, they're not all with a weapon or something like that. Some of them are very minor. My son he's not acting himself. And so some of those calls are what I'm talking about, that officers probably don't really need to respond to those. But many of them do. If you get a call, hey, some guy's yelling at the moon and he's swinging a knife around, well, you're going to send a police officer to that. But even if we had an alternate response, then the officer could respond to ensure that it's safe, and which includes maybe using less lethal equipment to get him on the ground without his knife, and then turn it over to somebody else and let the officer leave and go handle what only an officer can handle. So a lot of our shootings involve mental health. And we have less resources today than when I started 33 years ago. So we used to have mental health centers that officers could take people to, that other people could take. Those are gone. Now we take somebody in mental health crisis to the emergency room at a local hospital, which is one of the worst places you can take. That's not what an emergency room is for. And then it ties up the officers for hours there. So we need a lot more mental health. And I do believe for a small segment of our population, we need new laws that allow not us, the police department necessarily, but us as society to take somebody against their will into long-term mental health care, because they're not in their right mind and they're not going to go. But that has to be well structured. It has to be a well-defined process, because you don't want this to get out of control where we're putting everybody in there. And you don't want it to be what President Reagan Reagan shut down, where there's abuses going on and it's just kind of gone out of control. So it has to be a well thought out thing, but we need a lot more resources for mental health. We just, in the bad economies, a lot of them have gone away and they weren't great then.
So I'm going to say that the two alone are problematic, because we know that, let's just remove law enforcement from the equation for a moment and we just talk about mental health. Mental health has been so stigmatized in this country that it's not surprising that law enforcement is encountering people who are suffering from mental health issues, that they are not trained or equipped to handle them. And then we find ourselves in situations where we have someone's life who has been taken at the hands of a law enforcement officer because they had a mental health issue. I believe that a lot of times when they're showing up on the scenes, it's not like someone's got a shirt on that says, I've got schizophrenia. This is what's going on with me. Sometimes it's very clear and obvious. Oh, this person is exhibiting, these characteristics. Other times it's not so easy. But when we just talk about mental health, period, there are no resources, and people are afraid. I saw a news clip the other day about a doctor who committed suicide because she was depressed, being on the front lines dealing with COVID. And she had told her sister before she killed herself how afraid she was to seek out any mental health help because she didn't want it to be an issue for her with her licensing or anything else. And so I think a lot of us are running around here pretending that everything is okay, that we don't need any help. But deep down inside, there's a lot that's going on, but we are so distrustful, especially in the African-American, Hispanic, Native American communities, where I know when I was growing up, you take everything to the Lord in prayer. That's between you and God. You don't, there aren't these issues, oh, you're just a little depressed, oh, you're just hearing voices, things of that nature, not really understanding that people were really having psychological issues, but we don't have people in our community who look like us, who understand our cultural needs, that are culturally competent enough to be able to provide those services to us. And just overall, so mental health within itself it's its own issue. Then you throw in having to encounter law enforcement. And I'm gonna take it a step further and say that I believe that law enforcement in this country, just like our doctors, should in fact be able to receive anonymous mental health help. Because at the end of the day, and I tell Daniel all the time, I'm like, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you do it. I don't know if I could live a life of service for 30 years, and at any given moment a baby's been raped, somebody's been put in the microwave, 2 boys have been shot in the head, 9-year-old girl is struck, 3-year-old child struck in the head with a bullet, and these are normalized things. This is your everyday work. So the mental health of our officers that are out in the community is important too, because they very well may be engaging someone who's having mental health issues. And so now we've got these two entities coming together that are psychologically dealing with all of these things. And it's a recipe for disaster. So I'm an advocate for mental health all across the board. And we don't have enough resources. Mental health in this country is not considered, it's not considered a human right, and it should be, right? We should all be entitled to, especially in the day and age of COVID. People are suffering even more now. Violence is spiraling out of control even more now. The domestic violence rates are up, the child abuse rates are up, because people are now having to shelter in place if they're fortunate enough to be able to have a place to be able to shelter with.
Sarah, let me add a little bit to exactly what Jamilia was saying. Is one of, we could build up the resources for mental health, but if we don't deal with what Jamilia is talking about, is the stigma of mental health, and there'll still be people that don't avail themselves of those resources. And many of us in our society, especially in the communities we're talking about, are really kind of right on the edge. So all it takes is one change or one significant issue to happen, and then they're in danger of harming themselves. So the latest is COVID. So when COVID hit, we started seeing skyrocketing suicides, and predominantly in our young people. One day at the beginning of COVID, early last year, 2 high school students killed themselves unrelated to each other in the same day. I've never seen that in my career. But so young people now who have had their life turned upside down, not going to school, not participating in the activities that they normally did, basically locked in their house because of this pandemic that has come across, and maybe aren't equipped, or families aren't equipped to be able to deal with it in the best way possible. And now all of a sudden you see these things go up. So when we start treating the brain like we do a leg or an arm, nobody questions going to the hospital for a broken leg. But as Jamilia said, if your son or your daughter start acting different, or your uncle or your sister, well, we don't want to go to the hospital because, one, stigma, we don't want our loved one to be considered with mental health issues, but also in a lot of areas, we're concerned about the ramifications. So Jamilia brought it up. If a police officer breaks his leg, no big deal. He's going to the hospital. He or she will be off work for a month or whatever, come back light duty, work in the office until they get their cast off or whatever. If an officer is feeling like some mental health issues, trust me, every single officer is going, if I tell somebody, am I going to have a job tomorrow? Because it's considered differently. And so we are actually working right now in the Sacramento Police Department to create a program where every single officer goes to a mental health psychologist, psychiatrist every year. And so it's not a voluntary thing to where, oh, I see him going to check in, something must be wrong. No, it's standardized, everybody's going. So there's no stigma. And so we have to still work out some details, but the officers are on board. So it will get done. But those are the kind of things that we really need to start working out and start treating the brain just like we do the rest of our body. It shouldn't mean you get fired unless, the only time it should be told to somebody is if you're about right now going to, just like all psychiatrists would do. But other than that, even if somebody is not totally healthy, which probably none of us are totally healthy, it's not meaning that the alarm's going to go off. And no, it's meant to get you the help so you can lead a healthy life and perform at your best in a critical job like a police officer. So we are actually working on that right now.
And I want to thank you both for just being so open on this topic and for your time. And this is going to be our last question before we move on to the questions from the audience. Jamilia, I wanted to ask you, why do you think these types of conversations, well, I want to ask you first, why do you think these types of conversations are important to have with people who have not experienced gun violence in their lives?
Well, I kind of think it's hard to believe that people haven't experienced gun violence. They may not have directly experienced gun violence, but there's enough on it on the television that we see on a daily basis that I think people have a certain understanding. But I think it's important for us to be able to have these conversations because there are people in certain sectors of our society who have never been impacted by these things. And I think that, again, it goes back to the education component, right? And my biggest goal in life is to humanize us all, right? That we all have a common bonding agent, and that should not be that we're bonded in trauma. It should be that we all recognize that we are human beings. Our lives are all valuable. They are all worthy to be loved and to be taken care of. And so For me, these conversations are important because people may not get that information any other way. And it may just be that one line, that one something that touches someone and resonates with them in a way that it can propel change for them.
And then Chief Hahn, why do you think these type of conversations are important?
Well, I think expanding everybody's experiences is what is going to help us get to a better place. And I think I know we have a history in this country and actually around the world of dehumanizing certain groups of people. So if we dehumanize a whole neighborhood, and so when we see a death there, it doesn't really resonate with us as in when we see a death somewhere else, then that is harming our ability to make things better. Even the person that is, destroying a neighborhood with their actions is still a human being, and we should be impacted if they are to die. Whether it's in the homeless community that we've seen recently or in our neighborhoods where gang violence is prevalent. And so I think the more we have these conversations, and more importantly, expand experiences beyond the conversation, like let's go into those neighborhoods and spend some time and do some service work in there so you can actually have firsthand experience of what somebody else's experiences or whole neighborhoods are experiencing that you have no clue of because you didn't grow up there. We shouldn't be hating on anybody's experience. If somebody grows up in a wealthy neighborhood and has all the comforts of life, great, that's awesome. We shouldn't hate on that person for that, but that person should also be willing to go to another neighborhood and understand somebody else's experience, so then maybe we can help them have some of those same opportunities that other neighborhoods have. And if you don't see it firsthand, I'm a very visual learner kind of person. I have to see it and feel it and touch it for me to fully understand it. It's one thing reading it in a book or hearing about it in a class. It's a whole different thing actually fully understanding. And in my experience, when you take people to neighborhoods or take people to the academy, there is a lot more empathy that comes around. And then you can actually find some solutions, because I don't know everything. I don't know hardly anything. I need other people to come up with ideas. And then we can all get together and find out, well, what makes sense? So I think it's important for, if you don't grow up in the neighborhood where you see it firsthand and all you see it is on the news, it might not resonate as much for you as if you were able to meet and experience people and locations that might have different experiences.
Thank you guys so much. So now we're going to move into our Q&A portion of the event, answering the questions that the audience submitted through the Q&A function on Zoom. If anyone has questions they would like to submit, please do so now. So I'm going to turn it over to Mercy and Cameron.
All right, so our first question from the audience was, as an activist and as a police chief, has seeing these experiences of gun violence left you desensitized?
No, I'm hypersensitive. So much so that sometimes I have to remind myself to disconnect.
I would say to a certain degree, yeah. I think all police officers, if you weren't in a profession or in something in your experiences put you in those environments, you would not have the same response as a police officer does. Police officers see it all the time. So to a certain extent, yeah, I would say that's part of maybe some desensitization. But at the same time, like I mentioned earlier, I think being desensitized maybe is really on the outside. I think it still impacts human beings just shouldn't see things, and they definitely shouldn't see certain things over and over and over again. And so that leads into what you were just talking about in regards to mental health. Maybe on the outside, it doesn't look like it's impacting you. Maybe you're able to stand there and not look like it's impacting you and still carry out your business or your job or whatever, but it's impacting you on the inside, and sooner or later that's going to come out. So I think in a certain instance, yes, it is, but ultimately it's impacting, you're a human being, so it's impacting you.
Thank you. Two similar questions we received from the audience is, do you think there should be a gun safety program geared towards the youth to help with reducing gun violence? And what responsibilities should schools, particularly high schools and colleges, have on education on guns?
That's a great question. And yes, I do believe that we should have something like that in place. And I think that the education about guns, gun violence, how to properly use them, by the time they're in high school is too late. Last summer, the average age of the shooters were between 12 and 14 years old. You got to get to them before then. By the time they're in high school, it's too late.
I would say yes, but I would want like maybe some experts from some various fields to weigh in and what that experience or training or education would be. But I do think there's probably some value in demystifying guns, gun safety, and things like that at an early age. I think probably if we were going to talk about the most important thing for high schools and college to do that we don't really do right now and don't do enough maybe, or at all in some circumstances. And it really goes to the issue of biases and implicit biases. And that is teach our history, like our whole history. And because I run into daily people that are flat out wrong about our history, but they're not wrong necessarily because they're trying to be wrong. They're wrong because they were never taught the real history. So it's those people that say we never had slavery in California, so why do we need to deal with those things? We've never had Jim Crow and all those things. Those are all in the South, or they were all a really long time ago. All not true. All factually not true. We did have slavery in California. We did have Jim Crow in California. We had all those things in California. But if we're stuck on arguing whether we did or we didn't, we never actually get to the part where, well, how is it? What does that do today? What does that history? How does that history play out today? And once we know that, what are we doing about it? Well, if we're not even teaching that history existed, then we're not even to that point. And so I think probably one of the biggest things that, for a lot of reasons, not just violence in our community, but one of the best things high school and college can do is teach our whole history accurately.
Okay, so we have another question from the audience here. What are your thoughts on no-knock warrants? Somebody wants to know.
Well, I'll go. We've done away with no-knock warrants. No-knock warrants predominantly, I would think across the country, but for sure here in California, were used for drugs, for drug warrants. And drug laws have drastically changed. So the drug laws today are nowhere near what the drug laws, most felonies when I did most of my career on the street are misdemeanors now. And they're inherently extremely dangerous, no-knock warrants. And so I think what we have to be more cognizant of and implement what we do is it worth it? Well, we're going to take this huge risk of a no-knock warrant of somebody being shot. That could be the person in the house or the police officer. Both have happened. And what are we doing it for? Why are we taking this extreme risk? And is it worth it? And I would say for drugs, it's not worth it. Now, if this is somebody that's a mass shooter and is in the actively, well, maybe it is worth it. But I would say drugs are not worth it. And so I think the need for no-knock warrants has drastically changed. And maybe it probably was never worth it for drugs.
Great answer, because I was gonna say that's dangerous. If regardless law enforcement or not, you come into my house and I hear you trying to get in and you weren't invited and you not knocking, I'm pulling, it's going down. So yeah, it's dangerous. I wouldn't agree with that at all.
And the last question from our audience is, could a reform to the police system where departments with the most police-involved shootings be defunded be achievable?
I guess there's probably some realm of possibility that could be achievable, but I think what we typically do, which I think is part of our problem, is we have knee-jerk reactions where we make change really quick without implementing. So I see a lot of things that have merit and look like that's a good idea, but it needs to bring in various experts and explain it, explore it more and come up with a really good whatever. And we don't typically do that. So my guess is, I guess there's certain circumstances where maybe that's possible, but not possible by next week. And once you do something with the police department, what's in its place? So I mean, we're seeing this across the country right now. There's been departments that have been defunded. Look at Minneapolis. Now they just put almost $1 million, I think, into hiring, going back and hiring other departments to come into their city, or giving them more money to hire more police officers. So it's already within 6 months reversed opposite. So because you defunded something without something in place to fill a true need in your community. So me personally, I'm open to any ideas, but I'm not open to let's just do away with something with nothing to replace it, and doing it in a haphazard manner where people are going to get hurt. Because typically the people that get hurt are the people that have the least in our community. They're always the ones that suffer when things go wrong. So let's not do that. Let's explore things. There's also, I mean, that's why we bring Stanford and Washington State in our department. We don't have to have, I'm the chief of police. I don't have to have any answers. I need to know people that have answers. And then I can sit there and think, does that make sense or not for my community? So I think we just need to have first and foremost, the true desire to make change in our community so everybody can thrive. And then we need to be willing to bring in other people that might have different opinions from us and explore the opportunities instead of just knee-jerk changing.
I am all for well thought out, sensible solutions that we can implement in our communities that can have longevity. As I said earlier, you know, I don't agree that the knee-jerk reaction is one that can provide that. At the end of the day, what ultimately needs to happen is that we need to acknowledge the history in this country, acknowledge the damage that has been done systemically, intentionally, and we need to address those issues and those ills that are so pervasive in our communities, that are the breeding grounds for what we have seen manifest itself in these various problems. Until we actually get to the core and we begin to deal with the cancer itself, it will do us no good to continue to put a bandage on a gunshot wound that requires surgery. And like any surgery, after it's over, there is a healing time. You have to watch for infection. There may, depending on, you know, what's been injured, there may need to be some rehabilitation. You may need to learn to walk again, use your arms again. But we don't do that. We live in a society that it's instant. It's instant noodles, it's instant fries, it's instant burgers, it's instant, we want instant satisfaction and gratification. And we can't have that when we are talking about hundreds of years of problems that we're not going to fix overnight.
And Sarah, maybe I can give two specific examples, especially if some of the listeners want to know at least two organizations among many in our community that are doing really good things that both address crime and mental health. So there's a group of mostly teens called Impact SAC in our community, and they have put together like a mental health committee of teens. Because if we're talking about how do we help teens address their mental health issues and not commit suicide and all these other things? Is it good to have me, who hasn't been a teen in, at least 10 years, at least? That's for you, Jamilia. What teens did and went through and experienced when I was a teen is very different than it is now. When we left the house, my mom had no clue where we were at. She couldn't track us on a phone. There was no cell phones. The lights came on. We were supposed to be within earshot of our house. When the lights came on, we were supposed to be in the house. But when she rang her little gong on the back of the porch around dinner time, if you didn't come in, that meant you were too far away at that time. But other than that, she had no clue where we were at. I know everywhere my daughter's at now. I'm tracking her like a bloodhound on her phone. So, and social media and all the other things that go on, like it is a whole different world for a teen than it was. So for me to think about how a teen would address the stigma, it's best to ask teens. And so they come up with these and they have a check your vibe. And so now they do all sorts of stuff with teens, but this is teens doing that. And often we don't listen to teens. And then there's another group called Brother to Brother that have all been to prison for a significant amount of time. One of the co-founders, he was in prison for 21 years, including Pelican Bay and all that. So we bring them out to the academy. Every academy, they talk to the officers because we have a history in our country of dehumanizing people, whether it's Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Black Americans. We were civilizing them, which means they must have been uncivilized. They must have been savages and et cetera. And so oftentimes, not just in law enforcement, probably least in law enforcement, more in society, once somebody goes to prison, they're ex-con. We don't let them vote. We don't let them be on juries. So even though their sentence might be done, and even though they're accessing our roads and our cars and all that, and have elected, we don't let them vote for those people. We don't let them sit on juries because we've basically figuratively dehumanized them long after they've done their sentence. So that group comes out to help our officers not do that, because they see these folks that have done 21 years. You wouldn't even know Merv did 21 years when you talk to him. But also the reason I bring them up is if we're talking about people coming out of prison after being in prison for numerous years, do you want me deciding what they should be doing? I've never been to prison. I've walked through prison for like an hour tour, and that's the least place I ever want to go. That was enough. And so, they've educated me just through talking about things that people go through on the way out. So why don't we pay them to help people with reentry? Why don't we pick their brains of what people need after being in prison for 21 years, because they were in prison for 21 years. Now they're out of prison being very successful. So how about we have them help people come out instead of me? So here's groups that are that we're connecting with parole and connecting with our officers and are doing things in our neighborhoods right now that our officers can give somebody to them instead of taking to jail. And they've proven to be extremely successful. So it's those kind of groups that are in our community that we need to support, that are outside of really some law enforcement response, that's much more equipped to deal with certain segments of our community that are experiencing certain things. Why don't we use those sort of things? So I think those are groups that we as a community could really support. And there's other groups, City of Refuge, Rose Foundation, Jackie Rose, and other people like that that are doing some really good work, that have the experience and the knowledge to actually help people really, really well in our community.
So if I could chime in on that just one brief moment. He just opened the door for one of my lovely phrases that I've coined here. You've probably heard me say it several times about that lovely echo chamber of bullshit. All of those groups of people that are in our communities, and let me be specific, echo chambers of bullshit are not exclusive to Sacramento. They're everywhere, but I am talking about the ones here, where you have people, where you have groups that have not traditionally been accepted into this not-for-profit echo chamber. And so a part of the problem is they're not willing to allow new blood in, for lack of a better choice of words. And so we find people being stifled. At least she didn't run over, like jump in the screen and be like, Chief! But you know, it's important. And so there is a group that I actually would like to acknowledge real quick, because there's something that they are doing that I think is very important that we oftentimes don't talk about. And that is the Sacramento Village, the Village Advocates, excuse me, of Sacramento. And they are run by Charles and Allegra Taylor, who are our elders in the community. And they have a village mentality as to how they engage the youth. And so, you know, my 4-year-old engages, my 12-year-old, 17, 18, they capture children at all ages. And they provide the one-on-one tutoring. I've watched Allegra go into homes and set up, you know, computers and help the families with Zoom, and it's all inclusive. A lot of times when we are talking about helping our youth, we're focusing solely on the youth, whereas their approach is more holistic, and they are looking at the whole family. Because if mom and dad don't have what they need, the children definitely aren't going to get what they need. And I think that that's important. That's something, especially in the African-American community, that we have to get back to. That is a part of what is missing. We don't have that sense of village and that sense of community. We don't have our elders to be able to go and consult with and engage with, and our youth need that. And so I think it's very important. You know, I'm pleased that all of these groups are here. But one of the things that I would encourage is that our youth are watching us, and it's important that we set the tone for them. And so we can't continue to operate in these silos, continue to negatively come at and attack one another. And we cannot continue to fight over funding, because the reality of it is, like Merv, we're brother to brother. I love them to death. I know they're not getting any funding. I know they're not getting what they need, but they are the ones that are out there when we have a mental health issue with someone in the community. Merv shows up with someone from the Village Advocates and myself to say, hey, you know what, let's take this person, let's talk to them. We're going to drive them to the hospital. We're going to sit here and we're going to stay with them. We're going to articulate to the healthcare staff what it is they need. When they are ready to be discharged, we're going to come and get them. We're going to drive them home. We're going to make sure that they're safe. We're going to make sure that they're eating. And these are things that people don't know, and that a lot of these groups are doing out of their own pockets. But then we turn around, because the youth aren't dumb either. They know when they're being used. They know when they're being exploited. They know when, you know, people are claiming to be the voice of them, and they are not being reflective of what the youth are actually, what they're saying, what they need. And so I believe that in order to come up with a solution for some of the issues that plague our youth, we must engage them. We must talk to them and find out where they are, because, you know, we can build it, but will they come? Because was it built with them in mind? Did they have some input? Do they have equity in it? Do they feel as though, you know, this isn't just someone saying, well, we see a problem, here's a solution, now just take it, as opposed to, hey, they came to us, they talked to us, they engaged us, and collectively we built this. Because we have to be able to pass the baton on to the next generation so that they can move the needle forward. Because, you know, Daniel's a little older than me. I don't want nothing to happen to him, but we're going to be extinct. So you did the age thing, man. I'm just saying, you know. So, you know, it's important that we equip them. We equip them to be able to handle those things.
I didn't know Allegra was a computer guru. Now I'm calling her for my computer.
No, it's the kids. And I call her to give me one of the kids too.
All right, so that is all the questions that we have for you today. I really want to thank you both, Chief Hahn and Jamilia, for speaking with us today and just being open with this topic and share your thoughts and your experience on this important topic. Thank you for attending, and have a great rest of your night.
You too. Thank you for having us. Yes. Good night.